For 30 winters Hollis Grieve had spoken only to the wind. His cabin clung to the side of the mountain like a stubborn scar, its timbers weathered gray, its windows half frozen shut. Snow came sideways that night, driven hard by a wind that howled through the pines as if it wanted to rip the whole mountain apart. Hollis sat in his chair by the fire, eyes fixed on the flames, the shotgun resting where it always did within reach. He had no reason to expect a visitor, not after 3 decades of solitude, not since they'd buried Ruth in the hard ground beneath the old pine. At first he thought the sound was the wind playing tricks, a hollow knock muffled by the storm. But it came again, 3 measured strikes, not the erratic slam of a branch. Human. Hollis rose slowly, joints stiff from years without company, and crossed the room with the caution of a man who'd learned that strangers seldom brought good news. When he opened the heavy door, the night swallowed his breath. 10 women stood in the snow, their blankets soaked through, hair frozen into brittle strands, faces carved thin by hunger. The one in front was barefoot, her skin raw and swollen from frostbite. She spoke, but the words weren't English. Beneath her blanket, she clutched something small, too, still to be anything but a child. Hollis didn't ask who they were or what had driven them into a storm that could kill a man in hours. He simply stepped aside. One by one, they entered, leaving trails of melting snow on the cabin floor. Silence followed them in, a heavy kind of quiet that spoke of days without food, nights without warmth, and losses they weren't ready to name. Hollis stoked the fire higher, the glow touching their hollow faces. He didn't know it yet, but opening that door had already split the shell of his life wide open. The storm was no longer outside. It was here, and it had brought them with it. The storm didn't lift with morning. Snow kept falling, thick as pulled cotton, muting every sound beyond the fire's hiss. Hollis moved through the cabin with the slow care of a man not wanting to startle wild creatures. The women huddled close to the hearth, steam rising from their soaked blankets, eyes avoiding his. The barefoot one cradled the still bundle against her chest, her fingers clutching it like it was the last anchor in the world. When she shifted, he saw the truth, a baby, wrapped tight, its tiny face pale as snow. No cry, no twitch, just breath shallow enough to make a man doubt it was there. Hollis said nothing. He rummaged through Ruth's old trunk until he found wool socks and a jar of salve. Kneeling by the fire, he set them within her reach. She flinched, but did not pull away. Later, she rubbed the ointment on her frostbitten toes, and for the first time her eyes softened, just barely. That evening, she pointed to herself, then to her chest. "Hosa," she said. Hollis touched his own shirt. Hollis. It wasn't much, but the air seemed to shift, warmer in ways the fire couldn't explain. By the 4th day, another spoke. A tall woman with a scar running from her jaw into the shadows of her neck, Alawa. Her English was halting, but her story was clear. Soldiers had come, and their village was gone. Men cut down, homes burned, those who lived forced into the cold with nothing. 10 had survived the march through the snow. 3 more had not. There was no time to bury them properly. Hollis listened without interrupting. When she was done, he stepped outside, slaughtered one of his goats, and made stew rich enough to coat a starving stomach. The women ate until their hands stopped shaking. That night, a younger girl, Taida, sat beside him as he flipped through his old Bible. She didn't speak, only touched the worn leather cover and whispered one word, safe. He wasn't sure if she meant the book, the cabin, or him, but the words stayed in his chest long after she went back to the fire. Weeks passed beneath the heavy sky. The women began to mend cheeks less hollow, steps more sure. Hosa's baby, Nanton, cried for the first time, a small sound that carried hope through the cabin. Hollis built a stove with an oven so bread could rise again. Laughter faint and cautious, returned in fragments. But the mountain never let peace settle for long. One morning, Hollis found tracks in the snow boot prints and horseshoes skirting the tree line. The next day, they came closer, circling the smokehouse before retreating. He didn't need to guess who. Men who moved like that were the kind who enjoyed fear, the kind who expected no fight. He called Alawa and Hosa to see. "Eyes on us," he said. Alawa's jaw tightened. "We stand or we vanish." Hollis nodded. "Then we prepare." The cabin became a fortress in miniature, shutters reinforced with planks, firewood stacked against the lower windows, snares set in the brush, not for rabbits, but for boots. Hosa sharpened knives with the older women. The younger ones hauled water until every barrel brimmed. Night dropped hard and silent. They kept watch in turns. Hollis sat by the door, shotgun across his knees, ears tuned to every creak of timber. Sleep came only in moments, and when it did, it brought visions of fire snuffed out by boots stamping through the snow. Before dawn, the smokehouse was burning for real. 3 riders waited at the edge of the clearing, watching without a word as flames consumed the meat he'd worked days to cure. One raised a mocking hand before turning away. The message was plain: we know, and we will be back. Hosa's eyes burned with fury, not fear. "They're testing us," Hollis said, pushing. She met his gaze. "Then we push back." He taught them to reload, showed Hosa how to handle his revolver. "Only if you must," he warned, "but if you do, don't miss." The lesson was quiet but heavy, a line drawn in the frost. 2 days later, the baby's fever struck without warning. Hollis boiled willow bark, remembering Ruth's way of easing sickness. By morning, the fever broke. The relief was short-lived. That evening, an arrow landed at his feet, Apache make, but not theirs. Alawa turned pale. "They think we betrayed them," she said. "Now they watch too. No one wanted them. No one but Hollis. And maybe not even him, if the outside world decided otherwise." That night, Hollis prayed for the first time in years, not for himself, but for the women, for the baby, for a strength he wasn't sure he still carried. The mountain wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it a sound that pulled him to the door. A boy stood there, Apache, no more than 12, thin as a winter shadow. He said nothing, only placed a bundle of dried meat at Hollis's boots before vanishing into the darkness. A gift, a warning, or a test. They didn't eat it, not until they were sure. By dawn, fresh tracks appeared, a half circle around the cabin, the measured pattern of scouts. They were surrounded. Hollis said nothing, but the women saw it in his face. Hosa asked, "Are they waiting?" "For us to run," he replied. That night they sang old hymns mixed with Apache lullabies, the first music the cabin had heard in decades, but the fragile warmth shattered when a scream tore through the snow-heavy air. A woman's voice. Hosa lunged for the door. Hollis caught her arm. "It's a trap," she struggled. "What if it's real?" Against his own better judgment, he went alone. The voice led him to the tree line, where a woman stumbled toward him, barefoot, bleeding. Arrows hissed from the dark, one striking the tree beside his head. He dragged her behind a rock, fired once, and saw a figure fall, a boy. He swore under his breath, grabbed the woman, and fled back to the cabin. Her name was Kaya. She lived only hours, long enough to whisper one word: brothers. Hollis buried her beside the smokehouse in silence. At dawn, another cry came, not human, but a newborn's. On the doorstep lay a baby wrapped in fur, a white feather tucked inside. The message was clear. They'd taken one life, saved another. Hosa named her Alisi. 3 nights passed without movement, then torches flickered on the distant ridge. Hollis recognized the war chief, a man exiled for ruthlessness. The cabin wouldn't hold forever. Inside, 10 women and 2 babies leaned on one another for warmth, their eyes fixed on the door. The stillness outside was no longer peace. It was a held breath before the strike. Dawn bled through the clouds like a tired lantern, and Hollis walked the ridge with the slow patience of a trapper reading a snare line. The mountain spoke in small signs. A tuft of frost brushed from a stone, a spruce bough bent lower than yesterday, the hush that comes when breath is being held. Behind the smokehouse, where he'd laid Kaya under a slab of granite, a new feather stood stabbed into the marker black, slick with melt. Not an offering, a warning. He tipped his hat to the grave and felt the old grief tighten, then turned back toward the cabin. Inside, the air held warmth and worry in equal measures. Hosa rocked Natin while Elise slept in a basket lined with rabbit fur, her tiny chest lifting like a sparrow's. Alawa wrapped a shawl about her shoulders and met him with a question that did not need words. He answered with maps. On the floor, he spread the country of his life, ridges, hollows, frozen creeks, the narrow saddle that could carry them east if they chose flight over fight. "I'm not asking you to run," he said. "I'm asking you to outlive them." Alawa studied the lines, jaw set. "We have run enough," she said. "Then we make staying mean something." They rigged the woods with warnings wires, hung with tin and glass that would rattle at a thief's whisper. The younger women shouldered pails until every barrel brimmed. Knives were honed thin as promises. By nightfall, the ridge wore a quiet armor, and still the darkness pressed close. Far off, a ring of torches crowned the opposite slope and burned without moving, a patient eye that neither blinked nor tired. "He's counting us," Hollis muttered. "He's telling us he can wait." It was Taita who found the boy near the boulder field, a child no more than 6, barefoot, lashed, and left like a lesson. She wrapped him in her coat and carried him home, and when they washed his back, not a sound left his mouth, no name hung on him, only a small stone eagle at his throat. Hollis fed him broth by spoon. The boy watched every hand as if it might turn to smoke. That was when Elise's fever climbed like fire up a dry pine. Water and willow bark were gone. The river lay 2 miles down a chute of timber the scouts already knew. "I'll go," Hollis said. Alawa barred the door with her body. "They are waiting for you." "Then they'll see me," he answered, and shouldered his rope and rifle. He moved the way a man moves who has memorized his own country heel to toe, breath to breath, eyes drinking the dark. Ice creaked in the creek bed. He filled the canteen, dug for bark, and felt the air change. 3 figures stepped from the alders, faces painted, spears held easy as walking sticks. Hollis raised his empty hand and opened his mouth to the old words awkward, remembered from a life before Ruth, before solitude, phrases of respect, of peace, offered with a bowed head. The tallest warrior studied him a long time, then knelt and set a bundle in the snow, dried roots, bitter herbs, a small carved rattle wrapped in deer hide. "For the child," the man said in careful English. No threat followed, no order, only a glance that weighed Hollis like grain in a palm. Then they were gone, their tracks disappearing as if the mountains swallowed them whole. Back at the cabin, steam rose from the kettle, sharp with medicine. They cooled Elise's skin and waded through the longest hour winter ever made. When her breath eased and her tiny fists unclenched, Hosa wept without sound, forehead pressed to Hollis's sleeve. He stayed where he was, feeling the old cold inside him crack, not from heat, but from the fragile insistence of a life he'd almost forgotten how to hold. The boy with the stone eagle spoke his first word at dusk. He touched his own chest and whispered, "Hewn brother," then pointed at Elise and said, "Sister." The room did not move for a heartbeat. Then it breathed as one. That night they gathered close around the hearth. The children slept bundled in fur, their breaths shallow but steady. Hollis unrolled the maps again, but this time it wasn't about escape, it was about holding. "We stay," he said. The words no longer felt reckless. They felt like a vow. No one argued. The women sat straighter. Even Hune, barely more than a child, nodded solemnly. The fire cast long shadows across the floorboards, but none reached their faces. The fear hadn't vanished, it had changed shape, turned into something like resolve. The next days blurred with labor. The cold remained fierce, but the air began to change. A softness in the wind. Water trickled where once it cracked with ice. Alici's cheeks flushed pink again, and Nanton babbled beside her, mimicking sounds with stubborn delight. Still the mountain offered no rest. One dawn, Hollis spotted another feather black, broken wedged into the cabin's doorframe. Alawa found it first. She didn't cry. She placed it on the table like a dead bird and said, "They've stopped waiting." The war chief would return. Not as a scout, not as a warning, but as fire and iron. Emmett and Hollis dug shallow trenches beneath the snow. They fashioned spears from pine saplings and wired the trees with trip lines. Inside, the women melted tallow for torches and packed provisions for the children in case they had to flee into the forest. Then, on a night where the moon rose red as an open wound, the dogs began to bark. Torches crowned the ridgeline, not moving, just burning a wall of flickering teeth against the dark. A single rider came for. The chief's English was broken but clear. "They are traitors. You shield them." "They are survivors," Hollis said. "That's not the same." "To me," the chief replied, "it is." He turned and vanished into the trees. No fight. Not yet. Just a promise. Snow fell thicker that night, blanketing the cabin in silence. But silence didn't mean safety. Everyone knew it. Inside, they took positions, the women with knives near the door, Emmett on the roof with his rifle, Hollis beside the children with his shotgun loaded and steady. The attack came like a whisper, turned scream, sudden, fast, without warning. War cries shattered the night. Shadows broke through the tree line like waves. Emmett fired first, dropping a man in the snow. Hollis followed, each shot an anchor against the storm. The women moved like ghosts, swift and sure. Alawa slit the throat of one who broke through the shutters. Hosa knocked another down with a skillet and didn't stop swinging. The children were herded to the root cellar, their cries swallowed by the earth. The fight raged for what felt like hours. Blood stained the snow, black in the moonlight. Screams echoed against the cabin walls, then faded, replaced by the ragged breath of the living. Hollis stumbled outside, drawn by a shout from the woodshed. There, Emmett lay bleeding, clutching his side. Standing over him was Hune, the boy holding a bloodied blade, hands trembling but eyes clear. He had saved Emmett. In the dawn's pale light, the ridge stood quiet again. The torches were gone. The chief's army scattered. The snow bore red lines where they tried to conquer something they didn't understand, a home built not on walls, but on will. The cabin was damaged. Shutters hung loose, blood soaked into the floorboards, and one corner of the roof sagged from a thrown axe. But it stood. And more importantly, so did they. Later, as Hollis sat with Hune beside the fire, he looked into the boy's eyes and said, "You're not a killer." Hune said nothing. A tear traced his cheek. "You're a protector. There's a difference." Outside, the mountain wind carried the scent of smoke and pine. But beneath it, another scent began to rise, one that hadn't been felt here in years. Hope. The blood hadn't dried when the work began. Grief didn't stop their hands, it only made them move faster. Hollis patched the holes in the shutters while Hosa stitched the wounds that could be closed. The root cellar had half collapsed during the fight, But what remained now held not just food, but the memories of children huddled in fear and of women standing like stone. For days Emmett lay on a cot, pale and fevered. Hune never left his side. The boy cleaned his bandages, fetched water, fed him spoonfuls of broth. And when Emmett stirred, whispering that he should have died years ago, Hune only replied, "You didn't." Nothing more. They didn't celebrate. There were no cheers, no laughter, just the quiet movement of people who had survived again. Alawa wept one night, not from pain, but because she could finally weep. Not in hiding, not in the snow, but beside a fire that did not need to be earned by silence. Outside, the cabin wore its scars: openly scorched wood, a collapsed porch beam, the smokehouse gone entirely. But inside, something had grown roots. The next morning, they gathered around a new fire, not for warmth, but for memory. No English was spoken. Alawa lit the kindling. Hosa passed bundles of sage and cedar, and the children stood still, even the babies, quiet as breath. Hollis stayed back, watching. He didn't know their words, but he understood them. It was a funeral and a blessing, a grief honored, not buried. The mountain for once stood still. That night, Hollis sat on the porch alone. Snow drifted past, but the wind no longer howled. He heard laughter inside, soft, hesitant, but real. Hune's voice among the others, and Elise's squeal as she was lifted too high into the air. They were becoming something else, not just survivors, not just a family, a beginning. Spring came early that year, not with fanfare, but with subtle insistence: the slow retreat of snow, the glint of wet earth beneath melting drifts, the return of birdsong between the trees. Hollis noticed it first during his morning walks along the ridge. What had once been still and brittle now shimmered with possibility. Below, the settlement had changed. It wasn't just a cabin anymore. They'd raised 3 new structures, small, crooked, but solid. A fenced pen for goats, a new smoke rack near the edge of the woods, a schoolhouse half-built with stone and timber, the idea whispered by Saya, the oldest of the children who'd arrived weeks before. She'd said, "If we're staying, we should learn." So they stayed. And they learned. Hune taught 2 boys how to track rabbits without leaving prints. Alawa showed the girls how to cure hides. Emmett, his strength returning in waves, built a wheelbarrow from scrap and mended the barn roof. Tobias, once just a wandering fiddler, taught the children to carve toys from pine and whistles from reeds. Hollis didn't give orders. He gave lumber. He gave quiet nods. And when Saya brought him a hand-drawn sign for the schoolhouse that said simply, "Stars above, roots below," he nailed it up himself without a word. No one asked who they were anymore. They knew. They were the ones who stayed. Each evening, they lit the fire before the hearth. They ate stew thick with beans and laughter. The children played games that made no sense and all the sense in the world. One boy balanced stones like tiny towers. Another taught Elise to say, "Moon." Sometimes Hollis sat on the porch and listened to it, all the music of a life he'd never expected. He remembered Ruth's hands, her voice, the way she once said, "Your heart's not hollow, love, just waiting for someone to knock." They had knocked, and he had opened. One day, a letter arrived, carried by a half-frozen man with a mule and no patience for conversation. He said little, only that someone down in Pinneros had whispered Hollis's name and someone else had remembered the mountain. The note was short, no signature, just 10 words scratched in uneven ink. "More are coming, 15, young, alone, they need somewhere." No one spoke after reading it, no questions, just movement. Alawa gathered blankets. Hosa filled sacks with dried beans and oats. Emmett checked the roof. Saya swept the schoolhouse. Tobias strung new wire along the eastern ridge. "We'll build," Hollis said simply. "Before the thaw." Days passed in a rhythm of hammer and breath. Wood split. Stones moved. Smoke curled from new chimneys. When the children came ragged, gaunt, eyes wide with fear, the fires were already lit, the stew already boiling, the doors already open. None of the new arrivals were older than 11. Some came with bruises, others with silence. A few clung to one another like anchors, but none were turned away. "You're home," Hollis told them, and meant it. That night they danced. Tobias played his fiddle. Tassie spun in a ribbon dress that once belonged to Hosa. The stars above gleamed like old blessings renewed. No one knew what would come next, whether the law would find them, whether another war chief would rise. But the wind through the pines sounded different now, not hollow, not threatening, full, like breath, like song. The cabin, once a place of silence, had become something else entirely, a beginning that didn't end. The mountain never forgot. Even 5 years later, long after the blood had washed into the roots and the snow had turned to moss, its stones still carried echoes of what had been built there. Not with blueprints or titles, not with permission, but with hands and breath and the stubborn refusal to let good things die. The cabins had aged into silver. The children had become taller, stronger, and filled with fire. Kuhn taught the younger ones how to set traps and follow trails without leaving a mark. Tassie wore her red ribbons with pride and taught letters beneath the very sign she once painted. The schoolhouse was filled with laughter and chalk dust. Hollis still rose with the dawn. His legs moved slower now, but the cane in his hand had been carved by one of the girls who called him grandfather, even if not by blood. He walked the ridge like he always had, scanning the tree line not for danger, but for memory. Some days, when the fog rolled in low and the wind hummed just right, he thought he could hear Ruth's voice in the branches, not as a ghost, but as something quieter, a knowing. "You kept the door open," she seemed to say. "You let them in." And in doing so, he had found the one thing he never thought he'd hold again: a future. They were not a town, they were not a tribe by blood. They were something rarer, a family chosen in the ashes of what others had destroyed. Bound not by name or law, but by the fire that warmed them, the work they shared, and the pain they had survived. Visitors came, sometimes. Traders, wanderers, lost souls who heard whispers of a hidden place where orphans laughed and women sang over cedar fires. Some stayed, others left with food and a kindness they hadn't asked for. No one was turned away. Bertram never filed the report. The settlement never made it to a map, but he returned once a year with nails, salt, and stories. He said little, but he helped fix the roof. They hung pine cones from the trees, not for luck, but for memory, to remind the wind what had been earned here. The children painted them bright colors: red for courage, blue for truth, white for those who were lost. And on the first morning of spring, Hollis stood before the schoolhouse, one hand resting on the doorway, carved with every child's name. His bones ached. His beard had gone white, but his heart beat steady, not hollow, not waiting, full. Behind him, laughter rose, a sound more sacred than any hymn. He had lived 30 winters in silence. Then one day, a knock came. He opened the door, and the world changed.